everyone. So this is me and Jacqueline's presentation on MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail.
In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, targeted Birmingham, Alabama with a series of peaceful demonstrations aimed at ending segregation. The police reacted violently with attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. Hundreds of protesters, including King, were jailed. At first, King was criticized for taking on Birmingham. 8 white clergymen published a letter calling his actions unwise and untimely. But he responded with his own letter citing philosophers, religious scholars, and biblical figures to justify his actions. In order to demonstrate just how bad things were in Birmingham due to racism, which King addresses in his letter, we have decided to include some images to exemplify the seriousness of racism and segregation at the time. We would also like to include a warning as the images are violent and can be upsetting, especially if you or someone you know has experienced an incident of racism or even violence. If you would like to skip these images, you can go to time 130. Martin Luther King Jr. notes that protests are necessary because systemic racism has continued far too long in Birmingham, and they will no longer settle for unjust treatment. On page 1 of his letter, he notes, "It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative." King believes that nonviolent direct action creates tension in society. It was needed for the white people and clergy members in Birmingham to rise from racism and prejudice and stand beside the African American community in this fight to end segregation. On page 2 of his letter, he says, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." Dr. King has 4 steps to a nonviolent campaign, which include the collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. The African American community in Birmingham has gone through all of these steps. There can no be denying that racial injustice overwhelms this community. The first step is to collect facts to determine whether injustice is present. Dr. King notes that he has done this. He has analyzed Birmingham and seen that it is perhaps the most segregated city during this period. Police brutality consumes Birmingham throughout the country. The homes and churches of African Americans were bombed, with most cases left unsolved. Injustice is, in fact, alive in Birmingham. The second step is the negotiation stage, which is an essential aspect of the nonviolent concept. Peaceful and respectable negotiation was King's goal for political change. The third step is the self-purification step, which involves questioning your own moral strength and whether you can resist the violence forced upon you without retaliating. The last stage is direct action. Nonviolent direct action promotes tension, which encourages the need for negotiation amongst a group or community that previously refused negotiation. Tension is what opens minds, questions traditions, and introduces societal change. Without tension, new ideas can't be introduced.
King uses powerful rhetoric, and I believe on purpose, in order to emotionally and psychologically affect the reader, to expand our understanding and see things from his perspective, and also to reflect inwards on ourselves about what he says. One example of his powerful rhetoric is from this passage on page 2, which I will only read a little bit of as it is very long, but I encourage everyone to go back and read it. "But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness towards white people. The reason this passage is particularly powerful is due to his vivid descriptions and his examples he uses, which also continues later in his writing. He uses famous figures, especially from philosophy and theology, to explore his ideas. For example, when he goes into his discussion of just and unjust laws, he cites Augustine saying, "An unjust law is no law at all," and explains that any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages personality. What he means by this is that segregation laws are unjust because they are not moral or natural, as their purpose is to specifically oppress a marginalized group and make them believe that they are inferior. Even if they are technically laws and have gone through the legal hoops and have been approved, he suggests by citing Augustine that they are not real laws, because real laws should seek to uphold justice. To further make his point about unjust laws, he uses another powerful example when he references Hitler and the Nazis and the atrocious actions they committed under Hitler's control. He points out that technically everything that Hitler and the Nazis did to those in the Jewish community and beyond was technically legal, as they had made it a law, but still this does not mean it is right. His discussion of just and unjust laws revealed to the reader his thoughts on certain legal philosophy and highlights how certain laws should be questioned if they are unjust. So basically, the point he's trying to make is just because a law has been signed into law and people have approved of it, this doesn't mean that we cannot question these laws, especially when they are unjust. Though King is able to appeal to a larger audience of everyday people by thoroughly discussing the issues in society through his rhetoric, he also interestingly is able to play to the audience of his opponents. For example, when he addresses the claim that his actions will lead to violence, he asks them if this is really a reasonable claim and makes the analogy to Jesus by asking if they would blame him for his own crucifixion. While King is certainly a religious man, I believe he also knows that many of the white men in power in Alabama are also religious, and so he appeals to their religion in order to have a powerful effect on them by using examples they are familiar with and can relate to. Further, he is also able to speak in a very respectful manner towards the audience of his opponents, which are largely racist. For example, on page 6, he says, "If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable patience, I beg you to forgive me." Even though King knows that his racist opponents do not treat him with respect, he is still able to treat them with respect, which I think makes the letter all the more powerful. King is also very honest in his writing, especially in his thoughts of those who he thinks hinder the movement more than those who are outrightly racist. On page 3, he says, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than the absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." This quote refers to his thoughts on the white moderate, who he has become disappointed with, as he says that they have become more concerned with order than seeking justice, and this has actually hampered efforts for racial equality. And this is also something very interesting for him to point out, and I think this can also apply to a lot of situations going on today, not only in this country, but in many others. For example, those who are trying to, quote, keep the peace by saying they understand where people are coming from, but then sitting idly by and not doing anything to help is a large problem. To me, this can be equated with people who say that they are colorblind, as people who say this are in fact part of the problem of racism. By not seeing race, this means that they discount the experiences that people who are not white have to live through, as they are put at a disadvantage, even in today's society, unfortunately. All right, and now for our discussion questions. So when reading his letter, did King's rhetoric have an effect on you? If yes, how so? And what makes his writing effective? How can we apply his letter and what he discusses to what is happening in this country today? How can we apply this to ourselves? And how do you think MLK, if he were still alive, respond to racial inequalities today? Do you think he would still take the same course of nonviolent action, or do you think that it would be modernized to still be nonviolent, but, for example, it could be modernized by the use of social media, which is something they certainly did not have back in 1964.